the recording. And then, as usual, if you have any questions, just interrupt me as we're going through, and we'll answer those as we get to them. So we're going to look at monitoring, but we're just going to start today in data capture quick, just pushing a patient over, submitting it for review, just so we can use that patient in the monitoring application. So we're just going to select a study. I had created a patient this morning and filled out some information so that we didn't have to wait. So it was this guy. So we would go into the completed visit. We would go to the checklist, and again, just mark our checkbox here so the submit for review button shows up. And then we're just going to click submit and verify our credentials. And if we put in the correct username, we're just submitting this for review. So now this visit 1 for patient 020221 has been sent over to the monitoring application for review. And then if we had any subject level forms, same thing. So I had completed an adverse event form this morning, but after we complete that, we would just click on the submit for review button here, and it's going to push all of those subject level forms over. So now when we go into the monitoring application and select this study, we should see a visit 1. I believe I sent the screening over earlier, and then we'll have an adverse event subject level form. So we'll have a few things to at least look at, but I just wanted you to see this patient in data capture so that you can see it is real time and it's going to push all of that information over. So now we would go into our monitoring application, and we're just going to use UAT in this case, but UAT would be again used for your testing of the study, make sure everything looks good for production, and then our real external monitors would log into the production study monitor. And then we just select our role to sign in here. So in this case, we're going to use, I believe I assigned data manager. Come on. And when we log in here in a second, so the same thing as data capture, the monitor is only going to see the studies and sites that they have been assigned to. So right now I'm seeing everything just because this is a test environment, but in a real life scenario, your monitor is going to be assigned to 1 or maybe 2 studies or a few sites. They're only going to see over here on the left the studies and sites that they have been assigned to. So when they log in, they're going to get a screen similar to this. The middle here is just some metrics and just some overall study metrics on the study. The second line here, so the blue are these 5 colored boxes, right now aren't live links. So if we clicked on them, it's not going to take us anywhere. But once we select our study and site, these would be active links. So if we wanted to go to the subject list for that site, look at the in review, the open queries, adverse events, or protocol deviations, those would be live links for the monitor to click on. But the first thing they're going to do is we're going to select our study. So in the top left-hand corner, you'll have your select study box. Excuse me. And when we select that, you're going to see all of the studies that you've been assigned to. So we would select our study, and then it's going to refresh here and show us the sites that we have access to on this study. So in this case, this study may have 5 sites, but we are only assigned to the Los Angeles site as the monitor right now. The next step would just be selecting that site. So if we just click on the site, it will refresh, and now we have site-specific metrics across the middle here, and then in this to be reviewed. One thing to point out is the red box here with the white star in it, and that just indicates to the monitor that there is something new that needs to be reviewed on this study. And when we get into the visit in a second, or the subject level form, you'll see a red star on some of those CRFs, and that also indicates to them that that line or that CRF needs reviewed. So that's their indicator that something new has been added and they need to review. For the site is this white star. And then in this to be reviewed section, these are going to be all of the visits and subject level forms that they still need to review. And you can see here, here's our patient that we just pushed over, the 020221. So we have visit 1, subject level form, and then the screening that I pushed over earlier. So they will see as soon as we send that over, the monitor would be able to log in if they were reviewing that patient, or it just happened to be they were on site, something. They would see it immediately and they would be able to come in and start reviewing this. To review the visit or subject level form, they're just going to click on the hyperlink for the first one that they want to review. So we'll stay visit 1 in this case. It's going to take them into the visit, and similar to data capture, they're going to see at the top the study information and the patient information. So the visit, the subject number, the randomization number, all of that information. On the left-hand side, they're going to see all of the CRFs for that visit. And you can see here is the red star I was talking about. That just indicates to them that they haven't started the review on vital signs or medical and surgical history. So they still need to complete the review on those 2 forms. And then as they complete that, those stars will go away so they can keep track of where they are with those patients. But if they just click on one of the CRFs, it will display the CRF similar to data capture. So we can see this is our vital signs CRF. We'll see all of the questions. We would see all of the responses from our site staff here in the column. And then over here to the right, they're going to see the reviewed and the freeze columns. In this case, we have 2 eye icons because we have 2 monitors. So depending on how your study is set up, if you have 2 monitor roles or you're going to have 2 monitors, you would see 2 columns here with the gray eye icon. But if you just have 1 monitor role, then you would only see 1. So if in yours you only see 1 assigned, that's why there's only 1 monitor role. But for this study, I assigned 2. And you can see if you hover over them, it will tell you that this middle one is for the CRA role, and the one on the left is for the data manager. And because I've signed in under the data manager role, I can only fill out this column. I can't fill out anything for the CRA role unless I switch to that role. But this would be a way if you had 2 different roles, or some sites want to use that data manager role as an internal monitoring role or an internal review role. You could do that as well. So you could assign the data manager to your internal QA staff, have your CRA role as your external, and that way when we come in, the internal team can review this, mark this as reviewed, and then the external monitor would come in and they would mark their column as reviewed. And to mark something as reviewed, we can go line by line and we can check the box. Or if we've reviewed all of the columns on this CRF, we can use the select all at the top and it would mark all of those as reviewed. The last column here with the red snowflake or starburst, whatever this icon is the freeze column. That column will only be available to the data manager role. So that is the only role that can freeze data or unfreeze data. But what this is doing, or when we freeze this, it's locking this in the monitoring application. So previously when we click submit for review in the data capture application, it locked that CRF so that no changes could be made in the data capture application unless the site staff unlocked it. This freeze would take it a step further and it would lock that in the monitoring application. So then even the site staff couldn't unlock that without someone coming in and unfreezing this data. And that's where a lot of sites will use the data manager role as an internal review. They'll come in, review this, they'll freeze it so that no changes can be made before the external monitor reviews it. But that way also, if we need to unfreeze this and make a change, we're not waiting for that external monitor to unfreeze the visit or CRF for us. Does that make sense on the freeze, or any questions on the freeze before we move on?
That does make sense. One question I do have is, so for the data manager role, I agree. I think that's what we'll use for our internal QC. So when they sign into the monitoring application, do they have to sign in as data manager, or can they sign in as internal QC?
Good question. So there's an internal QA role that is just for data capture, and then there's the data manager role for the monitoring application. And it would determine, so we could use both roles for that individual if they were going to create internal queries. Because we'll get to queries here in just a second in the monitoring application. But if that data manager opens a query in here, it would be viewable to the monitor, where the
Okay.
internal QA role in data capture would keep that internal to data capture. So it just depends. If they're going to open those internal queries, we could assign them both roles and they could do the review in both, or we could assign it, they'll do the review in here. But if they had to open a query, then they would only use the internal QA role for those queries. So you can assign both roles if that makes sense.
Okay, honestly, it probably would be just the easiest just to have them be the internal QA then.
Okay. Yeah, because then they would create those internal queries. They would stay in the data capture application, and the monitor wouldn't see those.
Okay, so then we would assign somebody else as the data manager.
Yep. So you could still assign an internal person if you wanted, and they could just come in and mark these as reviewed and freeze them if you wanted to use the freeze. You also don't have to use the freeze. It's not a mandatory feature. You could leave this setup and just have the external monitor come in and mark their column as reviewed and never freeze the data if you didn't want to.
Okay.
So that's really up to you. The freeze is just taking it an extra step and locking it at the monitor level so that no one can make a change unless we unfreeze it at the monitor. So the site staff can't accidentally unlock it, change a date of birth or change a weight or a vital sign, something like that.
But Shelley and I are both data managers, right?
I think I assigned multiple roles to you. Yes, you have administrator, data manager, coordinator, and PI, I think. Just in case.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we are. So I think, Shelley, this is something I think in the future, if we really wanted to, we could, if there were certain fields we wanted to, we could decide to freeze them.
Right. Agreed.
And
I don't think it's something we'll use right in the beginning. I agree with you.
Right. But if it's something we decided that we wanted to freeze certain fields, then that's something we could talk about where to assign that. But for the moment, if we decided we wanted to freeze them, that's something that you and I could do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. And just to take it one step further, you could do this on a study by study basis too. So if there's one study that you want to lock or the data is really sensitive, you want to be really careful about it, you could use the freeze feature on that study only and not freeze it on any other study. So it is a study by study option as well. Yep.
Perfect.
So once we are ready to freeze the data, same thing. We would just individually click these or use the select all. And now when we save this, it's going to mark these columns as reviewed, and it's also going to freeze all of these columns in the CRF. So this vital signs form would be frozen. If we wanted to open a query though, so if the monitor or the data manager, if we were using that role, wants to open a query, they can select the plus sign here on the left-hand side, and it's going to bring up the query manager, and they can enter the query that they want to send to the site staff or the coordinator. So they can say whatever their message is, please review this response, whatever the entry is. They'll enter this query and they can open this, or just like the system generated queries, if they wanted to send this as an alert or an email to that specific coordinator or to the entire staff, something like that, they have the option to add an email. They'll see the entire user list, so anyone that's assigned to that study would show up here. And in this case, it's a test study, so there's only 2. But if they move that individual over and they open this now, it's going to open the query, So we'll see the little red icon indicating an open query, and then up here on the left, same red dot. But it also will send that email to that individual. So in this case, Brooklyn will get an email with that query for this patient and this study as well. So they do have the option to send the email on top of opening this query. And this query will open in the query manager here. So they would see, where's our patient? So at the top here, we can see at visit 1, we've opened one query. But also if we jump back to the data capture application quick, and we went into that study, on the query manager here, we would also see that. So as a coordinator, if someone from the site staff is reviewing these, we would see the monitor opened query as well. So anything the monitor opens will show up on this query manager along with those system generated. And then the internal QA would still show up on just the internal query manager. Okay, I'm on the phone. Any questions on opening the query?
Nope.
For the monitor, okay. And then as far as closing the query, so if we go back in here, and we went back into our visit. So if there was a previously opened system generated query that the monitor wanted to look at, or they wanted to close the query that they had opened or see a response, same thing as data capture. If we just click on this icon here, it's going to show us either it was a system generated, or in this case, it was opened by the data manager. And if they click on that hyperlink, it's going to show them all of the responses. So if, as a coordinator, we had gone in and responded, we would see that here. And then if the monitor is ready, they got the answer that they wanted, they can close this query, or they could add another response. If they still have another question or the answer wasn't satisfactory, they could add a response and continue through that process. But in this case, we'll say we're happy with the response, and we would just close this. And now it will turn to a green icon indicating that it was closed. And one thing I should have mentioned, let me just open another one. So if they open a query, when we open this, what it's also going to do is it's going to disable the review column over here. So they can't mark this line as reviewed with an open query. So as they're waiting for that response, they can't come in and accidentally mark this as reviewed. They will have to wait until they close that or get their response. They would close the query, and then they would be able to mark this as reviewed. So it's just kind of an extra security step. It won't let them accidentally review that when there's an open query. But now when we close this and refresh, now we can review this column again. And so we would just save or save and next, go on to our next CRF here. Yeah. So now the star, we completed the vital signs, so that star went away, and we know that all we have left is the medical and surgical history. For a log form, it works a little bit different. So the layout will show all of your entries here. And in order to go into that line, we're just going to click on the action button. So if we click on that action button, then it will show us the lines for, in this case, the screening visit. We can see the information here, and we can mark this as reviewed. And we could also go back and we could look at visit 1. And so we can mark these as reviewed and completed as well. I'm not going to mark these as completed just because I want to show you another way to complete or mark them as reviewed and frozen. So we're going to leave these as available, but it would work the same as the previous CRF. We just mark the boxes. But there is another way. If the monitor or data manager didn't want to click each box or each CRF, if they just wanted to mark everything was reviewed or frozen at once, from the checklist page here, we can mark the review data button. So if we click review data, what it's going to do is it would review all of these CRFs. So in this case, there's only 2, but if we had 10 CRFs, instead of going line by line and checking those boxes or checking select all, if the monitor wanted to, they could come here and just click review data, and it would mark all of those boxes for us. And then same thing, in this case I have to override because there was a query, but same thing with freeze data. If we wanted to mark those all as frozen without checking the box individually or clicking the select all on each CRF, we could freeze the data here once, and it would mark all of those CRFs as frozen. With this, with using the freeze from the checklist, we can also enter a signature if you wanted to. So this is not mandatory. We could submit without, but if we wanted to enter a signature, we could. And when we submit this, the signature will display over here on the right. So if you are using that freeze feature in the future and you want to have the coordinator, or I guess the internal QA or the data manager, whoever is reviewing it, if you wanted them to enter a signature, you could take that step and enter that as well. And then if we needed to unfreeze the data, same thing. We can unfreeze the data from here, verify our credentials, and it would unlock that in the monitoring application, and we could go back to data capture and change something if we needed to. So any questions on reviewing or freezing data for a visit?
Nope.
Okay. Subject level form is going to be the same process. It's just going to show here as your subject level form instead of the visit name. And when we go into that subject level form, you'll see the however many subject level forms you have, in this case 3. And then again, it will have the red star indicating that something has been filled out and needs reviewed. Same thing, we would just click on the action button because this is a log form, and we would just go through and mark these as reviewed and frozen and save that. So the only difference with the subject level form is instead of the CRFs, you're going to see all of those subject level forms display, even if there isn't anything entered, and you would just click on the one with the star and complete the review of that entry. If we didn't freeze this, so if we were just using the regular review, so CRA role, we'll say, comes in, the external monitor reviews these, marks them as reviewed, the coordinator unlocked it and changed something, it would show back up here on the list. So if we had already completed visit 1, but if we went back to data capture and we adjusted, say, date of birth, it would come back into the list here for visit 1, and that new field that we had changed the data on would have a star. So everything else would be marked as reviewed still, but that new piece of data that we changed, that date of birth, that CRF and that line would have a star indicating to the monitor that something had changed and we needed to review that again. So in case that ever does happen, the system will pick up on that change and it will submit it again for that line for the monitor. On top of being able to go into the subject level forms and visit one by one here, so if we go back in. So there's a few different ways to review. So we can go through and check the boxes here. We could use the checklist. And then there is a bulk review and bulk freeze option as well. So if the monitor wanted to, they had completed review on, say, 5 visits, and they wanted to mark review instead of coming into the checklist for each and clicking the review button or checking these boxes, there is a bulk review. So if we go up to review at the top, there's bulk visits and bulk subject level forms. If they went with the bulk option, they still do need to come in this way to see the actual data. So they would come in, they would still review the data, but they wouldn't have to mark it as reviewed here. If we go to bulk visits, it's going to show you all of for this study and this site, here are all of the patients that need reviewed still. And if we open those up, we can see the different CRFs that still need review. But we can't click on any of those and see the actual data. So we do need to go into those visits to see the actual entries from the staff for the enrollment. This is just marking that reviewed box or that freeze box. It's not actually looking at the data. But if they wanted to mark that, today they had gone through these 3 patients, we'll say, they can come in and say, this is patient 125, 116, and 221. I completed those. Click review data. And now it's marked those 3 as reviewed. And on the right-hand side, they're going to see a reviewed column. And if they click on that reviewed, they can see the 3 patients that they had just reviewed. Same thing with subject level forms. If they wanted to review those in bulk, we see all of the subject level forms for those patients, and we could mark those as reviewed. And again, it will show up on the reviewed column over here, and now we see those 3 as reviewed. Data lock or freeze is going to work the same. So there's data lock, bulk visits, and subject level forms. The nice thing about this is when we're freezing patients. So when we froze that from the checklist, we could enter the signature there and we had to validate our credentials. This is the one place where the bulk review may come in handy, is the freezing. We see the 3 patients, or if we had 10 or 20 patients, we could review those or freeze those. But instead of having to verify our credentials, in this case 3 times, or entering 3 signatures, we can freeze this data, verify our credentials once, and we could enter the signature once for all 3 of those. So that's where you may, if you're starting to freeze these in the future, or you're freezing them in large groups, this bulk freeze may save you time and may help. Because we know these visits have been reviewed, we just want to mark them as frozen and sign quick. Instead of doing that 10, 20, 50 times, we can do it once. And now when we save this, now we froze those 3 with just entering our credentials once and the signature. So it's up to you, or it's up to the monitor how they want to mark those as reviewed. They can go through individually on the visit or subject level form. They can use the checklist and mark that entire visit or all of the CRFs as reviewed and frozen, or they can come in and do the bulk visit, bulk subject level form, or the data lock, bulk visit, and bulk subject level form if we're freezing that. Any questions on the bulk review or bulk freeze?
Nope.
Okay. Locating a patient in the monitoring application. If the monitor or an internal staff is looking for a patient, we still have the same 3 ways as data capture. So you have your subject list here. They can always access the subject list and see all of those patients. There's a subject matrix for all of the randomized patients, and they'll see the status of the different visits. And then there is the search subject in the top right-hand corner, and we can put in whatever our patient number was and search for that patient. AEs and SAEs. If we've set up the subject level form, or any form for AEs and SAEs, so it could be a subject level form or a visit level, but as long as we've selected the form type of AE, in the data capture application, there's a report for AEs, and then also in the monitor. But if we pull this, the monitor can now see all of the AEs that were entered for this study and this site, and they can see all of the patient information and then the different questions that you have entered on that or created on that AE form. So this is just a nice way that they can quickly pull those AEs or SAEs, and this is in the data capture application too for the internal staff. But if they wanted to, they could export this as well. So you could export it to a PDF or an Excel file if they needed to export this and review this, or if you needed to send it to the monitor, you will have the option to export this to either type. If there are any reports that they need to pull, they would have the access to the monitoring reports. And then the last thing is the audit trail here. So if we went into a subject and a visit here, let me just go back. So as a monitor, if I come in to review this visit, and we'll say it's this screening visit, but I want to know who entered that information. So maybe I have a query that I need to enter, but I need to know who filled out this CRF. If I go to the audit trail here under services, once I have a patient brought up, it's going to show me all of the questions. So in this case, here's the adverse event form, and then here's the different questions. But now it's going to tell me who from the site staff actually filled that out and what was the original entry. And if the entry had changed, what was the previous entry? So if the monitor ever needs to see this audit trail to see, number one, who entered it, or was the response changed at any time, they can review that information from the audit trail here. And you can see here, we changed the date of birth at some point for this patient. So it has the previous entry and the previous age, and it has the new age and new date of birth here. So there is this audit trail if they needed to know who from the site staff had completed that, or if you need to pull this, you're already in the monitoring application as a data manager, you could pull this audit trail and see who entered that and if the value had changed.
Can you see that in data capture too, did you say?
Yes, so there is the same report in data capture, and there is so this is just for this visit, this patient, and this form in the data capture application and under reports here. There is a audit trail report that will pull the entire study as well. So you can pull, yeah, all of your patients or all of the audit trails, and then there's a site one down here that you can pull all of the studies and all of the sites. So there are a few different audit trail reports in both systems, but this will give them just the CRF that they're reviewing so they can see quickly who filled out those responses. Yep.
Perfect.
And that is it. There's a subject deletion we went through, but this is only in UAT, so this will never show in production. We looked at the data set report previously, but this will show you all of the information similar to the audit trail. If the monitor wanted to pull all of the responses for each CRF, they could pull that data set and see all of that as well. So any questions on the monitoring application or any of the steps we went over?
Not for me.
Okay. And then I don't know if we talked about this before or not, but so Nicole will update or upload this recording. So you'll have this training in Basecamp. We'll upload the guide, but then we also have an internal video that we did for this training that's just talking and working through all the steps with no questions. But we provide that in Basecamp as well, so that if you want to provide that to your external monitors, you have the guide and you have a clean recording that you could give to them. Because we all know we're busy. You may not have time to train all these external monitors. So you can at least provide them the video and the guide, and they can try to walk through all the steps, and it'll teach them how to do everything they'll need to know in there.
That's awesome.
And then obviously if they have questions, we're still here, but they should be good with the manual and the recorded video. So, all right, so we are good on the monitor training then.